Well, thank you. Yes, title of the talk is Effective Computing in Real and Immersive Environments. I'm Tiago Falk. It's a pleasure to be invited for this talk today. Nice to see you, everyone. I am a professor at the INRS at University of Quebec in Montreal, I believe just up the street from you. And so I wanted to give you an idea of some of the work that we do in this space in the lab. So my lab is called the MuSAE Lab. It stands for Multimedia / Multimodal Signal Analysis and Enhancement Lab. And our goal is to use signal processing so that we can provide and generate contextual information so that we can provide this information to machine learning algorithms to better guide them. And when I say contextual information, I'm talking about information from the user, from the sensors, from the environment, as well as information on if the system is trying to be attacked or not. So this is something that's more recent. So why do we want to do this? Why do we want to give contextual information to machine learning algorithms? Well, for one, we hope that with them, you can achieve greater performance. And since you're providing more information to the algorithm, then perhaps you need models that are less complex. We hope that with the contextual information, you can get models that are more explainable, also more robust to what we call in the wild, so in realistic scenarios outside the lab. And as I mentioned briefly, also models that are less prone to what's called adversarial attacks or spoofing. So this is more or less in a nutshell what we do in the lab. We touch in several different directions. We touch multimedia, we touch human-computer interaction. We also touch medical applications. So I'll go over a few of these projects here in this presentation today. But when we talk about the user and measuring context from the user, this is where the concept of effective computing comes in. So if you look at the definition of effective computing, it's the study and development of systems and devices that can recognize, interpret, process, and simulate human affective states. So the idea is how can you monitor the user's mental states or a person's mental state or affective states using either cameras or devices and so on. So when you look at applications, the potential applications are numerous, as you can imagine. So you can talk about monitoring, for example, shoppers and their shopping experience. You can monitor an individual, so you can target marketing applications, so you can target marketing ads and so on. You can talk about monitoring gamers so that you can adapt games to maximize fun and so on. Monitor drivers so that you can improve safety on the roads. You can look at, for example, applications in healthcare, education, sports, and so on. Interestingly, it's an area that was not severely affected by COVID. As you can see here in 2020, market research projected that or showed that it was a $28 billion market, and projections for the next 5 years is that it's going to grow to 140 billion. And the idea is that with the pandemic, most people are home, everybody's online. So now more and more companies have access to user data. And with this information, you're able to build tools to monitor people's emotions and people's reactions and so on. And you can see effective computing is also very tightly linked to what's called the citizen twin or the digital twin of the person. So this is where you're trying to build like a virtual version of yourself online. And as you can see in this 2020 hype cycle curve, it's something that's emerging. It's an innovation. It's technologies that it's still at its infancy, let's say. So the future is very promising. It's an area that is very promising. In particular, in our lab, we're interested in monitoring a user's experience, or what we call the perceived quality of experience. Now, this is a term that's been used a lot in the telecommunications industry for many years in the past. And a lot of the models and work that were done back then were relating only to network parameters. So that was more of a quality of service as opposed to quality of experience. So it's a term that's been used not properly for many years. So a few years back, the QualiNet consortium in Europe decided to get together and formally define what quality of experience should be. And the definition that they came up with was that it's the degree of delight or annoyance of the user of an application or service resulting from his or her fulfillment of their expectations with respect to the utility, the enjoyment of the application, and very important here, in light of the user's personality and current mental state. So what's being shown is that a person's experience not only relies on the system that's being used. So here we're talking about big screen TV versus a small smartphone, context, free service versus a premium paid service, but also on the human. So it's a triad. It relies on these three different parameters. And ultimately, if you see here the success or failure of any system, in the end of the day, it's going to rely on the quality of the human experience that it provides, and it won't be necessarily on the technology that it uses. So this, again, is an area where we have a lot of interest in the lab and where we use affective computing to try to model this kind of human, what we call human influential factors. So hopefully this video will give you an example. So I have a couple of videos here that for some, it might be hard to visualize how this human and how this kind of mental state could relate to experience. But these are just a couple of simple videos that might give you a better illustration of what I'm talking about. Hopefully you will be able to get the audio from it. I'll see in a minute. I'll give you just a little background here. So it's a bit old now. This was a 2014 World Cup game. So if you follow soccer, you know that World Cup is the biggest match for a country. This was a decisive game. This is US in white playing Portugal in red. US is up 2-1. And as you can see here, there's about 30 seconds left in the game. So again, this is a decisive game. Now picture yourself, a fanatic Portuguese fan, watching this game on your phone, on the bus, on the way home, eager to get home so that you can celebrate with your family. And this is more or less
beaten by the US.
Sorry?
And being beaten by the US.
Well, don't ruin the surprise.
That's the ultimate insult.
So here's a video. Let me know if you don't get the audio, please.
Changing the impact of this game.
Portugal on the brink of elimination. Can they do something here? It's Cristiano Ronaldo.
And then you get the wheel of death.
USA denied right at the death.
Now you can clearly see, regardless if you're a Portuguese fan or a US fan, that little glitch completely ruined your experience. Now suppose you're that same fan on the same bus, on your same device, now listening to the news.
Right now at our current temperature here in the Toronto area, we are dealing with temperatures that are pretty frigid, and we're dealing with temperatures around -17, -24. So we're lucky we're not dealing with temperatures like that. Unfortunately, it is very, very cold out there.
So you can have a sense, same distortion, same context, same everything. What changed was how engaged you were, how connected you were with what you were experiencing. So everything was the same, experiences completely different. So this kind of hopefully will give you a sense as to how that human influential factor plays a critical role in modeling qualitative experience. And this becomes particularly true if we now talk about virtual reality, where it's known that you can have two people side by side playing the same video game on the same device, same room, everything is the same. One person has the best experience of their life, the other's out in the corner throwing up because they're nauseous, and they had the worst experience of their life. So again, human plays a crucial role, and this is where we are venturing into looking at affective computing and seeing how we can use affective computing to model some of this information. So how do we go about on doing this? Well, as I mentioned, the human body reacts differently to different types of emotions and emotional states. So if you look into the affective computing literature, you'll see individuals looking at neural imaging to tap into the central nervous system. So here we're looking at MRI, EEG, functional near-infrared spectroscopy, and so on. Of course, the fight and flight body system, where you get changes in your heart rate and your respiration rate. So your autonomic nervous system reacts differently to different emotions. So you have, for example, sweaty palms, your temperature goes up, your face becomes red, your pupils dilate, and so on. Behavior cues also are very important to give information about the user's emotional state. So you look at gestures, you look at posture, you can tell if a person is engaged, you can tell if a person is bored, and so on. You can also look at, for example, size and laughter. Of course, facial information is one of the strongest or one of the most widely used modalities to monitor emotions today. So you're looking at videos and images and so on. But then also gaze information. You can tell if a person is paying attention or not, but if they're looking out into space or if they're looking at what's happening, if their eyes are moving in specific patterns. So there's a lot of also emotional information in eye gaze. So luckily, if we look at the wearables market, you can see that it's a market that is increasing drastically year by year. And it's not bound to stop anytime soon, as you can see in the curves here in terms of number of devices. If you look at the landscape of commercial devices back in 2018, this is already outdated. You can see the number of devices that were there. So now there's a lot of opportunity for you to monitor these different signals here. So there's a lot of room for innovations within affective computing. And this, I believe, is one of the reasons that it's an area that's booming and that it's emerging. But then, of course, having all this at your fingertips also generates a lot of challenges. So one of the first ones is now you have tools that are you can put in practically any part of your body. So which ones are more reliable, which ones are less noisy, which ones are more noisy, which ones provide you the most reliable information. And as the old saying goes, garbage goes into a model, garbage will come out. So how do you actually separate all of these different things? So this is a big challenge when it comes to affective computing. And the other, as you can appreciate, is what we call when you're in the wild. So once you take an individual outside of a controlled laboratory setting, you send them home, you send them to do different tasks in a realistic setting, then you start getting issues with missing data. The context is changing. So now is the heart rate going up because the person is stressed, or is it because the person is running around? Once they run around, the sensors move and then they generate artifacts. How are these artifacts causing errors within your system? And then you get things like COVID that causes unknown changes to the human physiology. So it causes changes in the way your heart beats and so on, and the way your breathing patterns change. So how does this confound all of the information that you're using? So in the wild is a critical thing that needs to be addressed, and it's a critical challenge that needs to be addressed. And the last thing here, multitasking. So as I said, you could be running and you could be stressed. So how do you separate the heart rate changes from the fatigue versus the stress? So separating these different things when you're multitasking, these confounding factors. So this becomes crucial for affective computing so that you have reliable applications. So in the next slides, I will give you an overview of some of the work that we have done in the lab over the last few years, and how have we monitored users and measured these different states in different scenarios. I won't go into a lot of the technical details, otherwise I'd spend many hours here, but I will invite you to go on our website and look at the papers and look at the videos that we have and software and so on. So one project that I'll go over is on monitoring nurse burnout in hospital settings. Another is looking at operator functional state. So this is a combination of fatigue, mental workload, and stress of first responders and police officers, for example. Then we go into gamers and looking at monitoring engagement levels and fun levels, fun factors. And then, as I mentioned, qualitative experience. So looking at a person's experience when they're using voice-based controls. And then going into putting sensors in cars and monitoring driver mental states, monitoring the flow states of dancers and performers. And then the last venture that we've gotten ourselves in the last few years is looking at qualitative experience when you're actually immersed in virtual and augmented reality. Before I get into those, however, I just really wanted to give you an idea that it's not something that you can go and collect data from a wearable device, throw into models, and raise your hands and say, I'm done. There's a lot of what I call here under the hood. So there's a lot of things that need to go in the background in order for you to actually get usable information. So this will give you a sense of some of the things that go behind all of the outcomes that we show. So first, as you expect, this is going to be noisy data, especially if people are moving, running. If you talk about first responders and police officers running and jumping and so on, it's going to be very noisy data. You're going to have noise artifacts that algorithms that are available in the market won't. They were never developed for this. If you look at EEG, for example, you get enhancement algorithms to remove eye blinks and to remove head movements. because the ideal scenario is you expect the person to be sitting down in front of a computer. So you will have to build your enhancement algorithms to get rid of, for example, gait influences if the person is walking or running and so on. So we've developed adaptive filters to do this. Same if you're looking at drivers, for example. If you're trying to predict which direction the driver wants to turn, these are very slowly varying cortical potentials. So you can expect very slow head movements to have a severe effect on these slowly varying what's called cortical potentials or movement-related cortical potentials. So if nothing is done, you can see that it's a very noisy signal that really generates a lot of artifacts and doesn't really help you with anything. So you do need to do some sort of enhancement in order to get the signal into something that's usable and that you can actually add to a car and make it usable. So these are projects that we had, for example, with Nissan and their brain-to-vehicle technology that they showcased at CES back in 2018. Again, heart rate is something that's used widely. It's available in almost every single smart device that you talk about, smartwatch, smart chest bands, smart whatever. And here's an example of how you can also do special kinds of filtering so that you can get an ECG signal that's highly corrupted with movement noise. So you can see you've completely lost information about heart rate. So this would be a useless signal to monitor user states, but through some clever enhancement, you can actually recover something that looks like this. You can see it's not perfect, but now you can recover heart rate. You can recover some information about the ECG. So you're able to actually do something with very noisy data. And then again, most of these devices will measure multiple modalities. In the end, we've shown that you actually need multiple modalities in order to separate what's the impact of fatigue on heart rate versus what's the impact of workload on heart rate and so on. So for you to have this discrimination of what's happening, you need to have a multimodal system. So now if you have systems that are streaming different types of information, perhaps from different devices, one might fail, one might be more prone to movement artifacts where another might. So if you have a decision system that does not take into account the quality of each individual sensor, then if one of them becomes faulty, that can really affect your decisions. So in order to build quality rules or quality decisions based on each individual sensor and then providing that quality information to your final machine learning algorithm, that's also something that's very important when you talk about in the wild effective computing. So this is something that we also spend a lot of time on, is building these quality metrics for different modalities so that we can then fuse them at the end. And ultimately, we want features, or what's called features, which are input to your machine learning algorithms. We want them to be robust to several of these artifacts. So here's an example of an accelerometer data with the person walking. You can clearly gauge the speed and patterns of their walking. If it's a noisy accelerometer signal, you kind of lose that information. But if you then map it to a specific signal representation that's more robust to noise, so here it's a special representation that we built that's a frequency mapping. So it's basically looking at the dynamics of the spectral components over time. And then you can clearly see that that information about gait is preserved in this representation despite it disappearing in the frequency domain. And we've also explored things like motifs, for example, that look at patterns in the data as opposed to amplitude values, which are very prone to movement artifacts. So if we're looking at patterns within the data, these are typically more robust to artifacts as well. So new signal representations also become very important when you're doing effective computing, especially when you talk about effective computing in the wild, where these artifacts become a big issue. And then lastly, something else that needs to be taken into account is the cross subject. So you know that each individual user, what's stress for you will be different of what's stress for somebody else. How you display stress is different how somebody else displays stress. There's also cultural effects. So how one culture expresses emotion is different from another culture and so on. And then of course also language. So a lot of these things need to be taken into account. They need to be normalized. Sometimes you need calibration. Sometimes you need what's called domain adaptation. So this is also an area that we do work in and show the impact of the different types of strategies before you go into effective computing per se. And if you crawl in one of the first slides, I mentioned that when I talk about context, I talk about user and environment, but then the environment can also have an impact on the user. So imagine yourself, for example, working in a noisy environment, your reactions are going to be different. Your emotional state will be different. If you have distractions also and so on, depending also on the circadian rhythm. So your body goes through this kind of circadian rhythm during the day where you're at your peak, and then there's lunchtime, and then you kind of get into a steady state, and then your body gets ready to go back to bed and so on. So depending on where you are during the day, impacts of stimuli can have different impacts on your emotional state. Location as well, if you're in a nice place versus a place that you don't really like and so on. So here's a quick example here at the bottom where we looked at neural responses of individuals doing specific mental tasks. We built models of what we call baseline states where they were just at a resting state. And then we had them in the purple periods here. They were doing a mental task that was emotional to them. And you can see that once they entered those states, the likelihood that they were in a resting state decreased. Once they were told to stop, the likelihood that they're in a baseline state went up. Once they started again, it went down. So you can see in a controlled environment, you get a very nice, very perfect representation of this kind of emotional versus non-emotional states. Once you have the person do this task now in a noisy environment, you can start seeing how the distractions and it starts affecting their performance as well. So you can see how that behaves. You can even add to the equation by adding distractions. So not only this constant background noise, which some people are very good at removing or filtering out, but if you have random distractions happening at random points in time. So here, for example, in these dashed lines, we played sounds like coughs and dog barkings and sneezing and so on to distract the person. And you can see now how messed up the signal becomes. So clearly, when you talk about users and you talk about context, the environment also plays a role. So then it shows how you need to not only model the user, but also somehow bring some of that contextual, environmental contextual information into account. So this leads us to some of the projects that we've done. So one of the recent ones that we were involved in, so this was a project funded by IARPA, the American Intelligence Agencies Consortium. This was in partnership with the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. And the goal there was to monitor over 300 nurses for a period of 10 weeks in order to track or detect nurse burnout. It's a issue that's affecting hospitals around the world. Nurses are overworked and levels of burnout are increasing drastically. So the goal of this project was to see if we could use wearable devices and affective computing to try to find correlates or try to find cues into how we could maybe alleviate some of this burden on the nurses. So we instrumented the hospital with a number of environment sensors. So these were location sensors, light sensors, noise level sensors. It allowed us to track where each individual person was within the hospital environment. We had them wear a custom device, an audio badge that monitored their vocalizations and verbalizations, not necessarily what they were saying because of privacy issues, but we extracted certain features from their voice, which were shown to be related to emotional states. And then the nurses also wore a smart shirt, in the case of females, a smart bra that tracked their heart rate, breathing rate, and activity. And they also wore 24 hours so this shirt was worn during shifts, so 8 to 12 hour shifts. The smart watches were worn 24/7 and were supposed to monitor their heart rate, activity levels, and sleep quality. So the goal was to build a tool that would allow us to track burnout, try to find if there are things within the hospital, if things were more related to when they're at home and so on. So it's a project that just ended data collection when COVID hit. So we've been spending the good part of the previous year analyzing some of this data and moving forward with the analysis. Again, I won't go into all the details here. We've had a number of different outcomes, but these are just a couple showing the importance of location and circadian rhythm. So here you can see a subset of some of the nurses on the top here on the middle plot. This is their circadian rhythm of day shift nurses. So you can see it really follows that nice curve. This is the circadian rhythm of night shift workers. So you can see how it's severely affected. So now when you talk about heart rate variability, you need to bring in that contextual information. If it's a day shift nurse, a night shift nurse, and so on, because the way the heart rate changes during the day really changes based on your shift. Again, here we tracked individual stress levels as they were migrating through the hospital. So you can have like different red flags and so on. And an interesting finding was that, for example, we noticed that most nurses, when they went to the medicine room, they started reporting increased levels of stress. And this was something that wasn't really intuitive to us. But then after asking and doing surveys and stuff like that, it was told to us that they usually dreaded going to the medicine room because usually most patients are very pushy when it comes to giving medication. So that's usually they know that when they're going to get medication, they know that they're going to be facing patients who are not going to want to take it. They're going to be fighting them to take the medication. So it becomes a stressful event for them. And this is something that wasn't really aware. So the hospital is talking about changing like the music and the environments as they're making their way to the medicine room to try to serve as a calming experience for them to try to minimize this kind of stress. So this is work that we're presenting at ICASP this year, looking at how context helps detect the stress levels of these individuals. And ultimately what we show here in a paper that's also under review is that the general trend when you look at this kind of monitoring and affective computing is to collect a lot of data, throw it into a very deep neural network and let the neural network do its thing. Let the network find the features, let it find the mapping, let it do everything. What we wanted to show here was that when you talk about affective computing in the wild, you really can't do that anymore. You need to bring in context, you need to bring in additional information. And what we show is that once you do that, you don't really need very deep networks. You can just rely on conventional classifiers and you can actually achieve much better performance than just throwing that information into a very deep neural network. So this was a shallow, a medium depth, and a very deep neural network, for example, and we show that the performance was significantly better by actually bringing in context than just throwing it into a neural network and letting it find everything for you. The other project was with the Police Academy, the Quebec Police Academy, where we were monitoring 50 students in their last year of studies, where they go through a 10-week test where they undergo written examinations, oral examinations, as well as field examinations. So these include simulations, these include shooting exercises, this includes physical exercises. And here we had them also monitoring them using wearables and tracking their stress levels and workload levels and so on. And I won't go into all the details here. Here are just some highlights of some of the papers that we've published with some of these projects, just to show you that it's through the feature engineering, it's through the multimodality, and it's through the quality awareness that we're able to actually monitor these users in the environment. So you can see we've been able to actually monitor stress and anxiety, how they link to operator functional states. We can separate the influence of physical activity from workload and stress, so we can separate them. We've been able to quantify the importance of different devices. So if you recall, the hospitals, they were wearing a smartwatch versus a smart shirt. So we were able to quantify the importance of one modality versus another and so on. So again, I won't go into all the technical details behind here, but I invite you to look at some of our papers and see the actual signal processing and the science behind a lot of these things. Two of the databases that we collected under this project have recently been made available. So this is very recent, December of 2020, made available to the research community. So we have two data sets, the walk data set and the past data set. One is focusing more on the mental workload under physical activity, the other on stress under physical activity. So this gives you all of the multimodal wearable data. This gives you all the ratings from the participants. This gives you everything that's available. So if this is something, if affective computing is something that you're interested in, I invite you to have a look at some of these data sets as well. If we move on to gamers, one area of interest is also gamer engagement. So companies want to make sure that the players are engaged, so that the more engaged you are, the longer you play, the more likelihood you have of purchasing things, of buying the next version of the game and so on. So keeping a player engaged is very important. Our hypothesis was that we could get some engagement information based on how you interact with the controller. So if you're pressing it harder, if you're moving the controller around, so the dynamics of how you interact with the controller, we believe, gave some insights on engagement. Instead of instrumenting the controller, we decided to look at if we could actually track this information through a smart bracelet that you see here on the top right. So this smart bracelet monitors EMG, so the muscle information around the forearms. It has a gyroscope, an accelerometer. So it's able to tell you information about the arm movements and so on. So we had gamers put these devices one on each arm, and then they went and played Assassin's Creed. So here I'll play a little video. So the idea of the project is we had them play this game. We recorded the game as they were playing. And then after the fact, we had the participants watch the game as they played it and rate not in real time, but post-game rate in a continuous rating their what they remember their engagement levels were. So on this left plot here, you see the blue curve, which are the continuous time ratings that they were reporting on the level from 0 to 100 of what they recalled their engagement levels were. Whereas the red curve is the levels predicted by the models that take into account the muscle movement and the controller movements based on the devices from both arms. So you can see here, there's a very close match between the actual ratings and the predicted ratings. We had a very high correlation in the upper 90s. But what was interesting here is you can see the red curve starts increasing or decreasing a few seconds faster than the actual ratings. And what this is telling us is that this is a problem that you face when you're trying to monitor users, is you can't really get real-time ratings from the user while they're doing the device, while they're playing the game or while they're interacting with something, because that will be disruptive to the experience. So usually you ask them afterwards to report. Now they have to go into memory, they have to recollect, they have to recall. So there's this delay between memory and what they recalled, and there's delays between the ratings and so on. So this kind of gives you a sense also that you can, through affective computing, actually get much better real-time information about what's happening. So you can see multiple times here, it's able to do it both when the engagement is going up as well as when it's going down. And it can have, so overall the correlation is very high, but you get this kind of benefit from real-time aspects. Next step was to see if we could actually predict fun. So here we looked at the same game, same paradigm. We had people play for a few minutes, measured all of these different physiological signals, and then had them watch screenshots and report on a continuous scale how much fun they thought they were having. It turned out that predicting fun was much harder than engagement, and it turned out to be extremely hard to actually predict on a continuous scale the level of fun. And in the end, we decided to take it as a two-step process, where ultimately the video game company is interested in keeping you engaged and keeping you having fun. So instead of reporting a continuous number, we decided to classify, is your level of fun changing? Yes or no? If it's changing.
Can we ask questions?
Maybe we leave to
Or at the end?
Maybe the end would be better.
Okay. No, so.
Thank you. So have a sense if the fun is changing or not. If it is changing, is the fun going up or is the fun going down? If the fun is going up, then as a game developer, you want to keep the game as is. You don't want to change. But if the fun is going down, then you need to make some sort of real-time changes to the game because you want the person to stay engaged. You want the person to stay having fun. You want them to continue playing. So this is where you would change the game. And if the fun is not changing, then you want to see, well, is now the fun at a level that's above average or is a level that's above acceptable? If it is, again, no changes to the game. But if it's below that expected value, then you need to do something so that you can bring the fun levels back up. So we found that this kind of scenario was the best. So when evaluating the data, we first explored what modalities contributed the best for these things. And it turned out that heart and breathing rates were the best modalities. And then in the end, we looked at the effects of normalization, fusion of features, and so on. So as you can see, accuracy wasn't that high. We're talking about F1 scores of 0.7, but this gives you an idea of the potential that there is with monitoring gamers in real time and adapting games in real time and so on. More recently, we've also started looking at monitoring, for example, drivers with sensors embedded directly on the steering wheel. So here we can track heart rate, breathing rate through these sensors. And from that information, we can monitor, for example, driver stress and fatigue. And now you can map that information directly into, for example, if you're driving a circuit, you can see that the person is mostly stressed when hard curves are coming up and they're having to do this at a certain speed and so on. So it tracks more or less how the driver information is changing over time. So this could in the future potentially be used, for example, to track race drivers and how to train race drivers, and maybe use as some sort of feedback to gauge the performance of drivers and race drivers and so on. And another area that we're starting to look into is not only the user and how affective computing can be used to track a user, but to track multiple users. So especially how in interactive scenarios where two individuals are interacting with each other, how can we use affective computing to quantify that interaction? So we started doing this with tango dancers. And the ideal is that Argentine tango has shown to actually have meditative capabilities. So individuals that are able to dance well tango, not only dance, but to achieve what's called a flow state, where they're dancing as if they're not even noticing that they're dancing. It's in these states that they end up, it causes something in the brain that has the same potential as meditation. So in the past, people have quantified this through behavioral metrics. So doing meditation and then measuring stress levels and so on a scale. So we wanted to see if there was any relationship between the synchronization of dancers when they were in this so-called flow state, how that affected their brains, how it changed their brains, that synchrony relates to them achieving this or not, and so on. And ultimately, the goal here is to kind of track individuals and see if you're a good candidate for dancing as a meditative replacement and so on. But this could also be extrapolated to other things. Two surgeons working together. Are these two individuals the best two to be put together for this particular surgery? Two people working together in a team remotely. Are these the best individuals to work together and so on? So we're looking at interactions between users now through affective computing and seeing if that has any relationship with performance outcomes. And going back to that whole concept about user experience, where, as I mentioned, you can bring in the human emotions and so on. So you go from quality of service, which is the network and the context, you bring in the users and the emotions, and you have now user experience or quality of experience. So we conducted a couple experiments where individuals had to interact with voice control devices, but in a far field setting. So far field meaning that the person is far from the microphone, so that effects of noise, reverberation, so reflections off the walls, affects the quality. So you know that if you put your smartphone and you say, hey Siri, if you're far away, it's not going to pick up. If it does pick up and you say something, it's likely to give you errors. And the ideal is that it's all of these noises that are generating problems for these devices. So the goal here was to see experience of people when using these devices at a distance and how their affective states contributed to the overall experience. So the first step was to get individuals to do a test and then just take into account, if you recall, quality of experience is a triad. So if we only took into account system information and we looked at how that was good at predicting, context here was the same. So we didn't vary context. So we just varied systems and we varied the human influential factors. So by varying systems, only system is only taking system information into account, we were able to predict quality of experience with an R2 of about 0.73 and a root mean squared error of 0.135. This is in a range of 1 to 5, for example. So this is about 0.1 in a 5-point scale, let's say. Now, if we took into account the ratings that the users reported into their arousal and valence states, so once they became very angry, very upset, or they were pleased with the outcomes that the device was picking up, then they reported their arousal and valence states. And if we incorporated those as true subjective factors of the human, you can see that we're able to get now models that were able to predict qualitative experience much better than just using the system alone. Again, here now, this is relying on the user providing this information. So we wanted to explore what would happen if we were able to use affective computing to predict those arousal and valence states. So we then built what we call affective body-computer interfaces or brain-computer interfaces to actually monitor these emotional reactions and then provide those as features to the model as opposed to the true subjective ratings. So you can see that by doing that, we're able to get a model that is significantly better than a model that does not rely on human influential factors, but there's still a gap between what you're able to achieve with affective computing and what you'll be able to achieve with true subjective rating. So this is motivating in the sense that it shows that indeed human influential factors play a crucial role in qualitative experience monitoring, but that there's still room for improvement in the affective computing scenario to bring this performance into this year. So this can be seen as somewhat of a upper bound on what could be achieved in this particular experiment. In a similar sense, text-to-speech, you have very high quality systems like Google with WaveNet. And then if you compare that to cheap toys that have synthesized speech that sound very robotic, very poor quality. So we had individuals, again, interacting with systems that had these types of feedback from very poor to very high. Same kind of scenarios before. We tried modeling their experiences using only system and contextual information. And this is the kind of performance that we're able to achieve. And then we asked them to rate their emotional states when interacting with these systems, and they reported their valence and arousal states. We added that into the model, and you can see the big jump that it had in accuracy in terms of qualitative experience prediction from 0.76 to 0.96. Again, we used affective computing to try to monitor those valence and arousal states and then generate a new model. And that new model, again, was significantly better from a model that didn't rely on the human influential factors, but then again, there was a significant gap to the upper bound. So again, suggesting that affective computing is very interesting, is very important for qualitative experience, but there's still a lot of room for innovations there. And our latest venture, as I said, is going into how can we apply all this information into virtual reality. So in order to make something that's of high experience, you can't expect a user to spend 30 minutes putting on an EEG cap and all of these sensors and devices on. That in its own, it's going to get the user bored, frustrated. It's going to affect the experience. So we wanted to build something that the person put on. The amount of time it took for the person to put the VR headset on is the amount of time it would take for our system to be set up. So we embedded sensors into the actual virtual reality headset. These are first prototypes where we actually Velcroed the sensors to the foam. Now they're all embedded. All the wires are hidden. It's a much cleaner version now. This is the first prototype, but the ideal is that you put this on and instantly you're able to get 4 different signal modalities. So the sensors are all around the faceplate. So you're able to get eye movements, you get face gestures, you're able to get frontal EEG, you get EEG also along the side straps, the central strap, so you can get information about the parietal, the temporal, the occipital, as well as the central midline. So you're able to get a lot of rich EEG information. We can also get ECG, as you can see here, comparing the ECG from the device to a chest, to a medical grade reference ECG. You can see that we get almost perfect ECG alignments. ECG, as we know, is modulated by breathing. So through clever signal processing, we can also estimate the breathing rate of the person with very high accuracy as well. So in the end, you put a device, you put this virtual reality headset on, it takes no longer than you would before. It has added about 200 grams to the headset, and instantly you're able to get EEG, electrocardiogram, eye movement information, facial information, and you can infer breathing. So our hopes now is to start playing around with this device, start looking into it, and see what kind of applications we can generate. So this is, again, just a view of the quality of the data that we get. So you can see the ECG going around. Gray lines here are when the participant were moving their eyes, clenching their jaw. So these are areas where you know they generate noises in the EEG. So through that enhancement part that I talked about and developing adaptive filters and so on, you can get rid of that information. So this is all done at the software level. So it has no influence on the user whatsoever. So again, you're maximizing, you're not changing the person's experience in order to measure experience. So that all becomes inherent in the, it's all transparent to the user. Again, with the facial information, you can detect eye blinks, for example. You can detect where on the screen the person is looking. And right now what we're doing is we're trying to, through all this information, actually track and see if we can predict XY coordinates. So we have devices with eye trackers that we're correlating this information with eye trackers and so on. So this is ongoing work, but this gives you an idea of the potential that it generates, or the extra potential that you're able to have with a device like this. Again, through the facial muscles, you're able to detect, for example, different facial gestures. So here we had individuals just sit neutrally, stressed and in awe and just happy with what was happening. So you can see the very different kind of signals that are generated. So this shows that there's potential, again, to not only find information in the heart rate and in the EEG, but also in the different facial gestures that are widely used in affective computing. We can use that to monitor the user. So there's a number of areas in which we're going to venture in. So the first, of course, is how can this all be used to track qualitative experience? With virtual reality, the experience also relates to if you're having motion sickness or not, if you feel that you're immersed or not, if there's a sense of presence. So hopefully a lot of this information will be able to find correlates of some of these things and see how they relate to a person's experience. You're able to, within your virtual environment, you can provide that information directly to the user. So you can vision this as, for example, some sort of virtual reality biofeedback where the person can have real-time information about their heart rate or EEG and so on, and then they can try to modulate that on their own. And there's a lot of clinical applications of feedback and neurofeedback. So this is an area of potential. And ultimately what we're interested in is building scenarios that are adaptive. So if you're tracking a person's experience, or if you're trying to track learning outcomes, or if you're trying to track stress states or emotional states and so on, you can adapt your environment in real time in order to track that. So here you'd be able to do that in an immersive environment as well. We did it with the gamers, if you recall, with the video games, with the armbands and so on. So here would be without any additional add-ons, just you put the headset on and you would have all that information at your fingertips. Those are some of the projects that we've worked on, some of the areas that we worked on. As I mentioned, that's not everything that we do. There are some other areas of interest. I think for the sake of time, maybe for another presentation, we'll focus on this. But when you talk about deep learning and deep neural networks, adversarial attacks becomes an issue. This is where you perturb a signal input to trick the neural network to think it's something else. The idea is that you're supposed to perturb the input in such a way that's not perceptible to the human. So if you look here on the left plot, red dots and blue dots are supposed to be true inputs and inputs that have been manipulated to serve as attacks. So if you just look at normal features to a naked eye, they're exactly the same signals, but some have been carefully crafted to generate attacks on the neural network. If you apply some signal processing, if you look at some properties of the signals, you're actually able to separate those very nicely, and you're able to now build networks that are more robust to these types of attacks. Again, with those signal processing representations that I talked about, taking signals into this frequency representation and how signal and noise become more separable in that domain. So one area that we've also been focusing on is, instead of removing the noise, which is what is typically done to enhance the signal, why don't we mine the noise? Now we know that this area is noise. Why don't we try to find patterns in this noise and see if those patterns can give us contextual information? And it turns out that if you're looking, for example, at an ECG, the patterns of noise in the ECG can actually give you information about if the person is sitting, walking, or running. So we've been using that type of analysis as well to find contextual information about the user. If you look at the noise patterns in the accelerometer, like I showed in the slide, you can actually get information about the gait speed. And of course, this is focusing on the use of these wearable tools to track user states or emotional states. If you take out the emotion and you just look at states in the sense of biomarkers, for example, then another area of research that we focus on is on using these tools as biomarkers in clinical applications. So we're looking at anxiety disorders, we're looking at Alzheimer's disease, we're looking at depression and so on. So I invite you, as I said, a lot of our tools, a lot of the stuff we do is open. So many of the software that we have is available on our lab's website, on our GitHub page. Links are up here. Data is available on our website under resources. Publications, under the publications, we have all the PDFs, all the papers that are published are there. Take home message, I like you, if you take one thing home today, it should be that affective computing is fairly at its infancy. It's here to stay. It's going to have, I think, a very prominent role in the next 5 to 10 years. Don't rely on it if there isn't any signal processing, providing some sort of contextual information or intelligence to machine learning algorithms. We've shown that just getting the data, the raw data, throw it into machine learning algorithms, you don't get as much than you would by spending a bit of time enhancing the signal, extracting contextual information, deriving new features. That's where I think most of the innovations will come in from. Of course, wearables are growing. They're not expected to go anywhere also. So wearables coupled with signal processing and machine learning, I think will be the combination of the future for effective computing. And as I mentioned, immersive experiences are becoming more and more widespread, where you see more and more companies talking about virtual reality and augmented reality. And I think user-aware experiences are in the horizon, and they're also going to be burgeoning sometime soon. So hopefully this is what you take from here. Of course, none of this would have been possible without all the students and researchers in the lab. So these are the people that have been involved in all of this research I've emphasized in the last few years. Of course, none of this would be possible without the funding agencies that fund our work. And that would be it for me. And we have a few minutes for questions, I hope.
Wow.
Nice.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I would say humbling presentation. So yeah, if there are any questions, Munir.
Yeah, I had, well, my earlier question was a very simple one. What were those criteria that you were using to decide that somebody's having fun?
Well, they reported. So afterwards, they watch their game and they report their own
So you
self-report of
tried
fun.
to match basically
Yeah.
the annotation they made on those episodes. Okay. And oh yeah, and you got results that are about the same as the ones I got, which is not very good actually.
For the fun.
I have a more technical question. In those multimodal sensing that you're doing, basically the different signals that you use have different bandwidths.
Yes.
And that might affect actually the way the system reacts to them, because if you have like a very slow signal and then a very fast one, then it all depends on when you sample and to get, you know, the input data that you're processing. So did you think about this at some point, and did you eventually did you do something about it?
Yes, it is a critical issue in a lot of the things that we do. One of the reasons that we try to map everything into different representations that somehow take away this time information, and it compacts the information over time. So we can look at, for example, for the same window of time for all the features, we then try to project all that into a space where all that information gets compacted. So here's an example of, I can put on the screen, where I can take an entire 5 seconds of a signal or 10 seconds of a signal and compact it into one image that tells me what happened in that image. So now this image can serve as information to a model where all the different modalities. So if it's temperature, where it's slowly varying within those 5-10 seconds, that's what would show up here. Whereas an ECG, the variation of the ECG, for example, within 5 or 10 minutes would be much larger. So now you would get different bandwidths that would be represented differently in this representation, but they end up being information over the same kind of duration of the window.
But those heat maps correspond to single signals?
Yeah, so this would be a single signal, but
And
now
what do? You put them together?
So we can put them together as inputs. So we've explored different ways, looking at them as kind of different channels. For example, if you have RGB and you have a three-channel neural network, so you can put them like that. Another way that we have done, so this work here, where I show the influence of the environment. So this model here, for example, was a hidden Markov model that was trained on multimodal data. And the idea now is that you have a model that learns interactions between these modalities. So it's not just looking at heart rate changes, but it's looking at how heart rate coupled with breathing rate, coupled with galvanic skin responses are changing. So the model itself is multimodal. So here was a hidden Markov model that we built that took those interactions into account.
Okay, so you built a generative model to try to account for this.
Yeah. But there are different strategies. The simplest, of course, being the decision fusion, where you build a classifier for each modality, taking into account the time limitations of each one, and then you fuse the decisions at the end. So this is the easiest way to take into account those time differences.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, I'll let other people ask questions.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
one quick question.
We have a question from Simon.
Yeah, thank you. So very interesting stuff. I wanted to go back a little bit to the annotation question, and just if you could sort of walk me through a little bit more of the annotation piece, and then also, and I may have missed it, and you may have said it, but whether you're using, unsupervised or semi-supervised structures aligned with that annotation process.
It'll depend on the project, and it'll depend on the application. So this particular case here, individuals were told to do something at specific points in time. So these dashed areas here would be times when they were supposed to be doing something. Whether they did it or not, it's not something we will know. We trust that they would be doing it, but we built a model that relied on their label saying that this is, I'm not thinking about anything. This is just me and my resting state. So we build a model of resting state, and then we gauge against the resting state. So you can clearly see that indeed they were doing something. They were told to do this task for 20 seconds. So here you can see this person probably after about 15 seconds stopped, because you start seeing the model after 15 seconds going up. So this particular person here probably didn't have the patience to do that for 20 seconds straight, and they stopped in 15. But the model kind of gave us some information. So here was completely unsupervised, where we didn't rely on any labels. But then on things like here, where you're asking person to rate their engagement level in a continuous level, those would be supervised. So this is now where the person has played the game, we have recorded the screen, and then they watch the screen, and then I have a dial where they're rating their level of engagement. So they're watching and they're trying to recall what they recall their level of engagement being based on the overall game they played. So they can then gauge that information.
You don't have any external annotation on this. It's all self-annotation in that context.
Yeah, so there's another area. So when you talk about stress, for example, you have your perceived stress and you have the perception of somebody outside you. So an external perception. So those are two different.
Well, no, what I mean, so I'll give you a good example, right? So I've done a lot of stuff around stress and physiology of stress. And we know that people's self-reporting of stress does not translate at all to their physiology. In fact, there's almost a zero correlation that goes on with that. So, and it's fine. It's just trying to understand the models, because obviously that creates the annotation piece potentially creates a huge shift in the reliability of the models. So I was just trying to get a sense of it. And I don't have a good answer. I'll be honest. This is the most complex thing that we have to deal with all the time, is trying to work out the meaning of the signal, right? So I was just curious to know. But thank you.
In our case, one of the things that we also do is we manipulate the experiment. So for example, with mental workload, we had individuals do different tasks. So we use the MATB, the NASA test that they use on pilots, where they have 4 different tasks that they have to attend to. And you can manipulate internally the difficulty of each of these tasks. And the individual is supposed to attend to all 4. And with a controller, he's supposed to be controlling all 4 at once. So you can change the level of difficulty of each of these 4 tasks to make it super easy and to make it super hard so that they're overcharging their mental workload. So ultimately, we asked them what their perceived levels of workload were, but in the end, we gauge and see, do we use the actual experimental setting as the ground truth? And in the end, it ends up being a combination, because even for an experienced pilot, even the super extreme hard condition is not going to be very hard for him or her. So in the end, we use the condition experiment to separate them into high stress or low stress, or high workload and low workload. And then we look at the individual ratings to kind of see, do these individuals fit within this paradigm? Did this individual have 2 clusters? Did they report being very stressed in the stressful condition? And did they report not being stressed in the not stressed condition? And then we're able to kind of give a confidence of these ratings based on the combination of the user and the actual task. In the stress condition, we had them basically play an exploration game, which was supposed to be the benchmark condition. And then the other was supposed to be a very stressful game, which is this zombie killing. Zombies are trying to attack you. We had them in a dim light room. It was supposed to be very scary, and people were really freaking out. Like, if you look at the stress levels, it's 2 very distinct clusters that really perfectly matched the 2 experimental conditions. But we rely a lot, not necessarily on the ratings because of the issues you highlighted, but we try to manipulate the experiment to generate 2 very distinct conditions in which the physiology better correlates. Hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Any other question?
Yes.
Marion, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm very impressed, in fact, quite overwhelmed by this presentation. So my thoughts are still, how should I say, being formed. You touched on so many points about which one could pose questions. But first of all, I, being a pilot myself in former years, I appreciate very much those experiences you just reported. And I was wondering if you've integrated these into pilot training. Because nowadays on the modern aircraft, as you know, you have to have computer science to be a scientist to be a pilot. So that's my first remark. But before I forget it, I also mentioned you mentioned the meditative state in which tango dancers fall in a flowing activity. I was very impressed by that because in martial arts, which I do also, meditative states are extremely important, and I'm impressed by the data information you got on that. I'd like to know more about it. And finally, just a quick remark: the work on nurses, the burnout phenomenon with nurses, is a very real and urgent problem, in my opinion. Having spent the last 3 years or so being in the hospital with a person who's going through EOL experience, I was there most of the time. And I saw these nurses in different states. And I can tell you that what I saw that fatigued the nurses most was not so much what you reported, the medicine room, but rather the cries of different patients urgently needing care and having to prioritize these. One patient might need to urgently have some biological function taken care of. Another might have fallen out of a bed and be injured. Another might be crying in some pain. And you hear these in the hallway. When you're in the room there, you hear all these sounds. The nurses hear all these, and they have to make decisions. And I'm just wondering, in your study, interesting thing that you had kind of a cool-off corridor where they go through before they enter the medicine room, which is bring down their stress state. And I was just wondering, have you thought more about those parameters? I think that's extremely important, because as you know, right now here in Montreal, at least, the hospitals around me, there's a critical shortage of nurses. And not only nurses, but what we call PAB, préposés aux bénéficiaires. These are the orderlies. All these people are under these extreme stresses. And I think it's extremely praiseworthy work what you're doing, especially if you come up with suggestions how to reduce the stress levels. Just quickly, it's a very impressive figure. I still have many questions asked, but those are just a few points. And kind of a question that you thought about the nurses stressing in the hospital.
Yeah, we had a large paper describing the data set. It's published in Scientific Data,
Oh, really?
Science Data or Nature Data, something like that. So I invite you to have a read, and if you have any questions or comments, as I said, this was something that's finished right before COVID hit. So we spent the good part of last year analyzing a lot of this data, but there's still a lot to be touched. Like this, the user data is what we were able to get access to directly because we built the pipeline to get that information directly. But we do also are slowly getting information from the hospitals as well, because information, like you said, like a patient fell or somebody died, that's not something we can capture from the sensors that the nurses were wearing. This is information that the hospital records and that the hospital sends to us afterwards. So we're at the moment waiting for this information to arrive to start looking at the impact of these things as well. So when you look at stress, it's not really known to us if the stress happened. We're able to detect stress, but we don't know if it's because somebody died in the nurse's arms, for example, earlier that morning or not. So we're hoping that with this information from the hospital, we'll be able to get a bit more high-level information and recommendations. For now, we just have the user studies and the locations. So this is where the insights are at the moment. But for sure. So I invite you to have a look at that paper. It describes into every detail and things that we have done. And from your personal experience, if you're able to see if there's something that we can do from that data and that relates to your personal experiences, I would love to sit down and have a chat and see if it's something that we can, if we can grab.
Thank you.
Regarding the dancers, this again was a study that started just before COVID hit. So we collected data from 2 people, and this is what we have on right now. But I was approached by these 2 Argentine tango dancers, and they were very interested. They had come across this research at a conference that I had gone through showing that it had the same effects of meditation. So people that were doing it, it ended up being better actually than meditation. So people had a control group doing meditation, they had a control group of people doing Argentine tango, and those that reported being in this flow state reported much lower stress levels after a period of time than the group that went and did meditation. And she was curious to see like what was going on in the brain, what was happening. Is it something that you only achieve when you are in this flow state? Is it something you can train people to achieve? Is it something that you only gather with experience? So there's all these different questions that we have no answers to at the moment. Our first task was to see, are we able to actually measure anything while people are dancing? We had experience with people running and walking with the police officers. So we built enhancement algorithms, for example, that looked at gait. These are fairly kind of periodic, but when you look at dance, like people are twirling and they're leaning backwards and so on. So we really wanted to see, is it possible to actually measure data, enhance this data so that we can then proceed with the project. So the data that we started collecting prior to COVID hitting was exactly a test to see if we could do it. We published a paper late last year showing that we could measure stuff. We could measure EEG, we could detect the flow state. We had dancers dancing to 3 different styles and rhythms. We showed some sort of influence between the type of music being played and the depth of the flow states that they were in. We were able to show some weak correlations between the synchrony between the 2 dancers and how the lead dancer affects the follower and so on. So these are very early stage research that was driven by this curiosity from the Argentine tango dancers and the study that they were presented at a conference showing the meditation process or the meditation potential of Argentine tango dancer. So I don't have much more to say other than it's something that is in our pipeline to investigate. And we have the entire Canadian Argentine tango community very excited and interested in being able to serve as participants once data collection is back up.
You bet, yeah.
And your last question was about pilots. We do have a project right now with NRC that's looking at their pilot training program. So we are equipping pilots with a lot of these modalities with the goal of monitoring, as you said, fatigue and workload, because cockpits right now are very complex.
Yes.
And measuring this in the wild, when they're flying and so on, is going to be very challenging. So that's our task right now, is to see what can be done with these devices in a real, so we have them in helicopters and we have them in fighter pilots or in fighter jets and so on, and just seeing the types of artifacts that are being generated and what type of algorithms can be implemented to remove them.
Thank you. May I write you with a few other questions or comments?
Yes, yes, please.
Thank you. I have but other people, I should cede the floor to others who have questions. A fantastic presentation. Thank you very much.
I will put my email here so that you have it handy.
Yeah, I can share it with people afterwards.
Please, thanks. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions, but I will let, if anybody else has questions, I will let them go before. Any questions? Okay. So one is sort of tongue-in-cheek, but the experiment with tango, is it specific to tango, or it's for pair dancing, or is there something specific to the rhythm?
I think the evidence that's been reported behaviorally has focused on Argentine tango.
Okay.
And I think tango has also been linked to helping, for example, individuals with Parkinson's. It's been used a lot to treat also Alzheimer's. Okay. So the suspicion is that there's something there behind the music, the rhythm,
okay.
The movement. It's still not clear what, but through partnerships with UCAM, we're also looking at, there's a researcher there that's looking at the use of dance to treat patients that have had stroke. And she's showing that the importance of these different tasks in the first 3 weeks of post-stroke. So it's when most of the benefit happens. So we're looking at exploring plasticity in the brain and how much of this gain do you get in the first 3 weeks, and what happens after 3 weeks? Are these changes happening mostly in the first 3 weeks? So being able to measure all of this in a portable manner, I think, is the key aspect. So I think it opens doors to a number of different possibilities. So we're only scratching the surface right now.
Excellent. I have two other questions, smaller ones. Is Munir still listening? Yeah, Munir still.
Yeah, I am.
So I'm glad, because you, in my mind, you settled the discussion I have had with Munir. For me, it's a question of faith that no matter how deep the learning, garbage in, garbage out, and my friend Munir tells me that you can throw anything at a neural network, it will extract all of the features. So I was glad to hear you confirm my faith, although, as I said, in my case, it's a faith. It's not based on science because I don't understand the stuff. But I'm glad that you confirmed that you do have to reprocess the data to get anything out of it.
Hafid, you're citing me out of context.
That's okay, Munir. I love you, you know that. The other thing is, I was intrigued by the work you have done on facial gesture recognition. I know Simon, he said he had to go, unfortunately, but they're doing work with facial recognition software. But you seem to be able to get quite a bit with without needing to record the video of the face movements, which I think is brittle and is probably fairly complex to do. If you could go back.
This is in the virtual reality aspect, right?
Yeah.
So again, this is something that we have started. So this is just to give you an insight on, if you have very extreme facial gestures, you can see the different patterns in the signals that we're measuring. There is, again, a high variability between subjects, but there is something that seems to be there. And it's something that's not available with just a conventional virtual reality headset. I know there's big push for these more recent devices coming out. They have cameras in front so that you can track arms and so on. A lot of them are putting cameras inside to track the eyes and look at eye tracking, pupil, and so on. Some of them are actually putting cameras under to track the face so that you can detect if the person is smiling and so on. So now you have a camera that has like 12, or you have a virtual reality headset that has 12 cameras. And as you know, processing video is not something that's simple. If you're processing now 12 video streams in real time, it becomes very complex. So the whole goal here was to try to be simple, and instead of relying on multiple cameras to track the eyes, can you do it with just the same sensors that are tracking information about the facial movements? Can you separate the contributions of the smile and the eyes and so on? So it's more of a exploratory right now in terms of what can be done. We have the eye tracking and we have the EEG and the EOG signals. So we're, as I said here, we're trying to explore now how close can we get to the actual eye tracking. We haven't been able to, right now we're at about 83% accuracy. So we're not at a place where we can replace the eye tracking completely. So if you really want to know what place the person is looking at, you still need the eye tracking. But if you're just interested more or less in there are zombies coming on the top right corner, and you can easily detect using one channel information that the person is looking to the top right, that's all that you need. So you can bypass this whole issue of processing 4 cameras in real time to detect the exact XY coordinate to just one very simple 250 hertz signal that tells you the person is looking at the top right. And if that's the level of the resolution that you need for your application, then you can do a lot more with a lot less.
Excellent. Very good.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, you can.
It follows on with your comment, actually.
You want to settle it? You can take it offline, Munir, you know.
No, I'll ask the same question I asked this morning to a keynote speaker. You know, as I said earlier, I'm in the middle of a conference that's taking place in Peru. And the keynote this morning was a big shot from UC Berkeley, who's also co-founder of a big company in California. So he told us about the prospects of what to expect. His message was essentially that this COVID-19 actually was not a disaster for everyone. There are fields that actually benefited from it, and mainly all of the digital companies, if you want, actually got a lot out of it. And he gave us a bunch of things that should basically draw traction, if you want, in the future. But he didn't mention AI, actually. So I asked him, I said, why is it that you're not mentioning AI in all this stuff that you're giving us? And he said, well, the main issue is that you know, we have all these algorithms, but we cannot guarantee that what they're telling us is true, because essentially they're black boxes. And in his opinion, the only way that AI can be used usefully is actually as an add-on, as an accessory to more formal techniques. Okay, so basically we should go back to basics, and then use AI just to help us with those basics.
Was this person in the health field?
No, this guy is actually in the circuits and systems. And he's a co-founder of Cadence, if you know the company. Okay, Cadence is a company that makes tools to design integrated circuits. Yeah. But the guy is, you know, he has a kilometer-long CV with a bunch of status and so on. Anyways, my question is this, because I noticed that in your case, actually, you're not just using AI, you do signal processing prior to just dumping the stuff onto a neural network. So would you agree with this accessory position? Or do you think that neural networks are it,
I stand by the position that I think signal processing has come a long way, and machine learning is now, I think, still in its infancy. It's still going to go a long ways, but I don't think it can discard. I don't think you can discard you can't discard signal processing and just move on with signal processing innovations, or sorry, with machine learning innovations. Because I think in many applications, you're going to have this problem. If you look at health, this whole black box issue is critical. Doctors are not going to want a black box telling them, oh, this patient has this or that. They want to know, well, what did you focus on? How did you find this? What did you see? So I think in some areas, it's going to be very important to have that information. In others, not so much. So if you're talking maybe about detecting movement on a screen or detecting objects for a robot, maybe it's not so critical why the robot found that to be a chair versus a table. You're just interested in the robot detecting chairs versus tables. So in some applications where you see machine learning or artificial intelligence really making a big push, is more in this computer vision type approach, not necessarily linked to health applications. Because I think in health, even then, there's going to be this issue of black box. My view is that both have to kind of walk hand in hand right now, because it doesn't matter. You can measure heart rate and give heart rate to an artificial intelligence system that relies only on heart rate. And if it detects the heart rate going up, it's going to say it's a heart attack. But if you don't have context, if you can't say that the person is climbing up the stairs at this point in time, and that's what's causing the heart rate to go up, there's no information that the system can take other than heart rate was here, now it's here. It went up in 10 seconds, and heart rate is not supposed to go up in 10 seconds. So clearly something is happening. So without this context, it becomes very hard for a system to really be perfect and to achieve what's really expected of artificial intelligence. So I think the two have to go together. I don't think it's something where AI, I do believe that the innovations in AI are great. You can't really achieve results that you could achieve before with just signal processing. So I think just signal processing is here, AI is here. You can only go beyond that once you bring the two together.
That's you.
So I don't discard it completely, and I didn't emphasize it here in this presentation, but some of the reasons that we do this, why we do this, is not necessarily just to improve performance, but it is to, where's the slide here? So it's not just to improve performance, but to also maybe generate things that are more explainable. Make them more robust, less prone to attacks, and so on. Because these are other issues, right? Like if you talk about adversarial attacks, that's the major Achilles heels of deep learning right now, is you can tweak some input somehow and make the system think it's something else. And if you're talking about real-time real applications, that becomes very critical. And if you look at cybersecurity now and all the issues and surrounding cybersecurity, if one of your main pitfalls of your deep learning algorithm is that it's prone to these very simple cybersecurity attacks, then that becomes a very easy target. So I think there's still a lot to be done, and there's a lot of room for signal processing to help with filling some of these maybe limitations. So I agree in parts, but not completely with the statement.
Well, I do share your opinion on this. And Hafed, do you have your answer in other words?
Yeah, very good. So we're going to leave it at that. Tiago, thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you so much.
This was an excellent eye-opening talk. And we will be hard-pressed to match it. So this was a great opportunity, and I hope this will lead to some future collaborations with some of the people who attended today.
I hope so too. And I leave
you
here the last
seem to be very busy already, but so I see lots of great opportunities.
Perfect. I'll leave my email here again. Please feel free to email. And as I said, most of the publications are on our website. If there's some that are behind paywalls, let me know and I can send them to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Merci à
Thank
tout
you,
le monde.
everyone.
Thank
Merci.
you. Goodbye.
Have a
Thank
wonderful
you very much.
Take care.
Most interesting.
Thank you.